Hi, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. I'm Dr. Marie McNeely, and I am thrilled to have you joining me today for episode 685 with our guest, Dr. Joel Berger. As you know, listeners, through our podcast, we're working to introduce the world to scientists, science careers, and some exciting science. So if you support our mission and you want to support our program, you can donate through our crowdfunding campaign at patreon.com/sciencepodcast. or visit the support page of our website at peoplebehindthescience.com/support. Every dollar makes a difference, and we truly appreciate everyone who has helped us over the years continue sharing the stories of inspirational scientists. And today, Joel has some excellent stories of his own to share. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our wonderful people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, I am thrilled to be speaking with our guest scientist, Dr. Joel Berger. So, Joel, welcome to our show today. How are you?
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Well, I am so excited to have you here with me, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about you and more about your science. So let me just take a moment here right at the top to tell our listeners a little bit more about you and how you got to where you are today. So listeners, Joel is the Barbara Cox Anthony University Chair of Wildlife Conservation at Colorado State University. He's also a longtime senior scientist with the Wildlife Conservation Society and the author of multiple books, including most recently, Extreme Conservation: Life at the Edges of the World. Joel earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in biology from California State University, Northridge, and his Ph.D. in biology from the University of Colorado Boulder. He was awarded a Smithsonian Postdoctoral Fellowship to conduct research at the National Zoo's Conservation and Research Center, and he was subsequently awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, which supported his research for 4 years. And before joining the faculty there at CSU, Joel held the position of John H. Craighead Chair of Wildlife Conservation at the University of Montana. Joel's received numerous awards and honors over the course of his career, including the Aldo Leopold Conservation Award for Lifetime Achievement from the American Society of Mammalogists, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Institute for Parks at Clemson University, the Society of Conservation Biology's LaRue III Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Conservation Biology Award from the Denver Zoological Society. He's also an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, and he is a 3-time finalist for the prestigious Indianapolis Prize in Conservation, one of the field's greatest honors. And today, Joel, we want to get to know you, of course, as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
Thanks again, Marie. I don't want to sound too much like a geek, but I love what I do. I like to hike. I like to watch animals. I like to drink good coffee. And I like to travel to remote places. And these are the things that I do for my job. And these are the things that I would be doing even if I didn't have a job. If you push me really hard, I would say, well, I like to body surf, but I don't live on the coast. I live in Colorado. And so that's out.
Gotcha. So what constitutes good coffee for you, Joel?
Good coffee is local roaster, grind the beans, and sometimes add in some steamed milk. Sometimes it's a cappuccino. Other times it's a latte.
Oh, you're a connoisseur, I can tell. Well, it's great to hear a little bit more about your life outside of science. And I think you're definitely not alone here. A lot of people who study these areas of conservation, biology, things like that, really do enjoy getting out there in the natural world. It's sort of the real life application almost of your research. So let's talk about your science in a little bit more detail. How do you describe it to people who aren't familiar with your research?
So in my elevator speech going up to 4 floors, I tell people, well, I try to save the world. But of course, their eyes roll and it's like, oh, give me a break. And so if I go deeper, what I'll say is that I try to save some animals, but not necessarily those like whales or tigers or elephants, but more so those that don't have much of a voice, those that are not on the radar of most people. They live in faraway places and they just don't have a body of people that are out there advocating for them. And then people will say, well, like what? you mean wolves or grizzly bears? And I'll say, well, no, maybe a Takin, which lives in Bhutan and in the remote Himalayas, or maybe a Huemul, which lives in the shadows of melting ice in Patagonia.
That sounds wonderful. And I think it can be motivating kind of being on this mission like you are to save the world, as you say, to try to save these specific species, particularly ones that people may not be familiar with. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what motivates you. Do you have a particular quote or a saying, or maybe just a mantra that really resonates with you, Joel?
I once had a WCS colleague say to me, Joel, you have to remember, here's the question, why should we care? And this came about because People magazine did a feature in the late 1990s on me dressed in a moose suit. And it was for my research, which I'm not going to go into at this moment. But Bill said, Joel, I don't care what you dress up like. If you can get a seat at the conservation table, dressing up or doing something else and help make decisions, then that's important. So the who cares question is a very motivational question for me.
Absolutely. And I think part of the challenge in conservation specifically is getting people to care.
It is.
Absolutely. And we're talking about inspiration and motivation. And I know in science, there are a lot of people to look up to, sort of the people who came before you and pioneered the research. So do you have any mentors or role models or people that you particularly look up to, Joel?
Some people, at least in the realm of what I do, might pick Alexander von Humboldt or even maybe a Charles Darwin. But for me, I would clearly pick two or three. And one would be Amy Vedder, in part because of the challenges that female scientists, especially in the field, but writ large, have to undergo, and for which many of us males have no clue what that is like. And she used to work with gorillas and work with Bill Weber, worked with WCS. But also George Schaller, very, very motivational, worked across the world. He's been doing this since the late 50s. And then maybe a last one, David Quammen, because he's such a beautiful nature writer and hits topics with such vibrancy.
Absolutely. And you're an author yourself. Can you tell us a little bit more about this aspect of the work that you do?
So as a scientist, the currency for us are data, but not just data. It is moving the data into what are referred to, and most readers maybe know this, peer-reviewed publications. But for me, that gets a seat at the table sometimes, but doing science is not doing conservation. Doing conservation takes so much more. So I use my science as a tool to move ahead and to communicate with the public. And the public isn't going to read very dry science papers. But if one can tell a story and weave in the details that would have the why and the where and the when, but do it in a nice storytelling fashion, then there may be some cachet there. So I've tried to do that in 3 or 4 books.
Absolutely. I think kind of taking that next step and making that connection with the broader public is so important for science and scientists. And I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your story, Joel. Can you maybe take us back to the very beginning and share with us what were some of these earliest memories that you have of first getting interested in the natural world or being excited about science?
So I grew up in LA, and that would not be Louisiana, but the other LA, Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And even though it was California, the winters seemed to be cold. And so I wouldn't go to the beach and I wouldn't go body surfing, but instead I'd get on a motorcycle and go out to the desert. And so I was one of those guys that liked to be in the desert, but zooming around. And I gradually saw too many dead tortoises, too many coyotes hanging from barbed wire. And progressively, I got less into using motorcycles, and I enjoyed hiking in the Sierras, hiking out in the Mojave and the Great Basin deserts, climbing mountains. But the real passion was when I saw animals, I got to watch them, and I really enjoyed that. And I remember my grandfather, now deceased, Russian-born, but moved to the U.S. when he was very, very young. And he said to me, if you like watching animals, why don't you find a job that will pay you to do that? Which was unheard of to me going to college in Southern California, where there were not strong ecology programs and certainly not much in the realm of conservation. But it lit a fire under me. And so I then pursued that in graduate school and then at Smithsonian, where I was a postdoc. And that led me into much broader worlds in the world that I now work in.
So then can you tell us a little bit more about these key steps that maybe helped you get to where you are today there in Colorado?
So after I finished at Smithsonian, I was mentored by some excellent conservation practitioners who were doing biological diversity when it was first coming out, biodiversity as a word. And I gradually was in an academic position. I became interested in how to use different aspects of technology to test questions. And then this experiment fell into my lap. And the experiment was this: rhinos being poached throughout Africa. 2 countries, actually 3, started to dehorn the rhinos, remove the horn. The idea being, well, maybe there's no incentive for poachers to shoot the rhinos if they don't have horns. And hence the experiment was set. I wanted to go and study what is the purpose of a horn, or how are rhinos without horns being able to navigate their biological world. And so that brought me into the realm of WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, with their support in the early 90s. And so that was my first real engagement in international science, science for conservation, and with a very strong umbrella called politics.
Absolutely. And it sounds like you were actually able to travel there to Africa at that point. What was your first experience like, kind of being out there in the field in a different country and relatively new to this area?
I was very new to it. My wife at the time, Carol Cunningham, and I had a 19-month-old baby.
Aww.
And we had no base of operations. So 7 out of every 8 weeks, we were camping.
Oh, wow.
And we would go grab a shower, head to the Capitol or an institute, and then go back another 7 or 8 weeks. And so we lived like that for a little over 3 years. So what was that like? It was hot. It was dirty. It was mostly waterless. It was eating not very well. But it was phenomenal in terms of being able to be on the ground, boots in the desert, and gather information on rhinos that were horned and dehorned up and down the Skeleton Coast into Etosha National Park with a graduate student named Janet Racklow over in Zimbabwe.
Oh, that is so cool. And I know you've got some phenomenal projects at the moment. So, Joel, do you have a particular project that you're working on that maybe you're just the most excited about?
We've recently completed a project that involved combatants of different species at high elevations. And the reason I mention this is something of interest to me and to my colleagues, Forrest Hayes and Mark Beal, is because as the climate is warming, we certainly know globally, both at the highest of latitudes, the lowest of latitudes, and the highest of elevations, ice is leaving. And in some places, the loss of ice allows bedrock and soil to build up and minerals. And the minerals in these soils are very patchy. And so in our particular case, we wrote a paper that dealt with which species compete most. So it turns out in North America, what we were finding are 2 iconic species restricted to the Western U.S. Bighorn sheep are one, and the other are mountain goats. And mountain goats are a goat antelope. They're not really part of the goat family. Equal size, but we witnessed some 100 or more interactions for priority of access to these minerals. And mountain goats won something like 98% of the time, so they were the winners. Bighorn sheep were the losers. And the reason that this has some relevance, we think, is first, people haven't been on the ground to actually document anything more than an anecdote or 2 of 1 or 2 interactions. And so we accumulated a pretty consistent pattern. But then scaling up a little bit more so, as climate changes, it's probably safe to say we're going to see challenges at lots of different levels. In the one case, so maybe minerals are exposed. But if we drop off of high mountains and drop down to deserts, we see groundwater depletion. We see springs or water holes of extreme importance, and animals probably concentrated. Well, we do know, based on some of the work we've done in the Gobi Desert, based on some of the work we've done in the Namib Desert and the Kalahari, that there is more forced competition and aggression.
So were you surprised, Joel, to see that the mountain goats ended up being such a fierce competitor that they were winning the vast majority of the time?
So I've gotten a lot of grief because, being very honest and truthful, we were surprised, and I've gotten grief over that. So initially we had predicted, hey, mountain goats, bighorn sheep, they're similar in size with everything else being equal. half the time the sheep should win, half the time the goats would win. The reason we got grief is because people are saying, Joel, didn't you know goats are aggressive? And it's like, after 3 decades of working with these large-hoofed mammals in lots of parts of the world, maybe I didn't really know that they were going to win this much. What does this mean? It means that Joel Berger can be wrong, which is certainly not the first time. Probably many times I can look in the mirror and say, oh, I blew that one.
And I think that is such an important lesson for the public to understand and for scientists themselves to understand that you can be wrong. It is part of the process to kind of make these educated guesses about how things are going to turn out. And sometimes you do prove yourself wrong. And I think in science, sometimes these failures, these challenges, these things that go wrong all happen at once. And I know there are sometimes these kind of critical moments in people's careers where it seems like everything is just falling apart. You have a major failure or a big struggle with something. Have you had one of these experiences yourself where you really struggled with something and had to work through it?
Like all of us, I hope that we can admit that we've had struggles and that we don't know everything. One of the biggest challenges for me is when I was working in the Arctic, and this wasn't the North American Arctic, it was the Russian Arctic only a few years ago when relationships were tense, but not certainly as they now are between the US and Russia. And to get to my study site, which was an Arctic island about 60 miles north of Siberia, the northeast edge of Russia, I couldn't just fly there from Alaska. I had to fly around the world to Moscow, 9 time zones east, land in a little town called Pevek, P-E-V-E-K, just in case people were looking. And I was the only American on the plane. Russian security forces came on as soon as we hit the tarmac. They knew where the Amerikansky was, and I was arrested and let off the plane.
Oh, no.
Then I was put under house arrest until a judge could fly in from some other town, which I didn't even know where. So that set me back a bit, and I tried to understand that and keep it in perspective.
Absolutely. So what was going through your mind there when you're sitting on the plane and about to be escorted off by these very official looking people?
It was like, this is a good one. What am I going to do? I wonder if Colorado State University is going to be able to do something, or I wonder whether WCS, or maybe I wouldn't even be able to access anybody. I was worried.
So then what helped you kind of overcome this setback? You said that kind of put you back in terms of the timeline of the project, having this interruption, we'll call it. How did you work through it?
I had Russian sponsorship from some Arctic scientists in Russia. So they ultimately got me to the island. I was able to gather data. And as I mentioned, focusing on climate change and how it brings more polar bears to land, and then how muskox interact with polar bears. And so that helped me think through, okay, I have some data. I've got some support. I'm probably going to get out of here safely. But then the next setback, and this is still related, so there's a long-term one. 2 years later, I was scheduled to go back, and I was denied because I had been arrested, and I haven't been able to be back into Russia since. Now I could go back, but those grants are now ended, and so I do other things.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I think that is something with these international travels, these international field projects where it's like visas, permissions, kind of getting all the paperwork together can be a big hassle there.
Yes, it's easier to sit at home and to not do that. But then we know what our overall impact is, and it's not going to be what we would like to imagine.
Well, we appreciate you taking us through one of these difficult times in your career. And I think it just shows unexpected things can happen in science and on these field expeditions in particular. But we don't just want to focus on the troubles. Joel, I'd love to talk about some of your successes. Can you share with us perhaps one of your favorite success stories, whether it was a small but meaningful win or one of these big wins?
So I'm not sure that I would call this one small, but of course I smile because I mentor students who carry the torch forward. And they do this in lots of different ways. Some work for non-government agencies, others become faculty or chairman. Some work for state or the federal government. So that's kind of my promotion on the science and conservation front. But I guess the one that I feel like I played a really big hand in, well, I won't say big, but I played a strong hand, would be the U.S.'s only federally designated migration corridor. So lots of animals have to move from summer range to winter ranges. And out in Wyoming, we were able to work with the state and then the federal government. And we achieved success for this 40-mile long, 1 mile wide corridor that allows free passage of animals without fencing and without fracking and without gas and other energy development. So I would claim that one as a success.
Oh, that's really cool. Can you give us a sense of what kinds of animals are using this corridor?
So popularly, it is known as Path of the Pronghorn. And that really conveys what it is. It's a pathway, but the path is about a mile wide. It's about 40 miles long. And so pronghorn, Lewis and Clark in 1803 called this kind of an animal speed goat. And that's what they called them, speed goats. But we now know them today as pronghorn. And they navigate from Grand Teton National Park to the south about 40 miles.
That is amazing. So how did you celebrate this big win? And I imagine took some time to get to that point.
We got in a bit of the trenches and we worked with oil and gas industry. We worked with the ranching industry. We worked a little bit with Native Americans. This pathway was known to be used by pronghorn for some 6,000 years. So through a number of investigations of archaeological sites, it was discovered that this is the way that these animals used to migrate. And then we worked with the public, we worked with the federal government, state government, and several different agencies. And so it was a lot of in the trenches, town meetings, presentations, discourse, animosity toward us as outsiders. But in the end, this was put on what's called the Federal Register, open for public comments. And out of about 20,000 comments, more than 19,500 said, this is a given. We should do this. We're losing biodiversity rapidly in so many different ways and the processes that sustain it. This is an important one. And so under George W. Bush and Dirk Kempthorne, his Secretary of Interior, this got a lot of traction, which to me was wonderful because it wasn't just talking to people who see the world my way. It was a bipartisan cooperative event. And after we had this dedicated protected corridor, the state of Wyoming invested more than $10 million to build an overpass to allow the animals to continue to migrate. And this overpass concept has now been working and taking hold.
Definitely. And I think in your particular area of this conservation research, you have to interface with a lot of different stakeholders. It's not just conversations you're having with other scientists or with trainees. So what is this part of your work life? And how did you, learn to speak the language of all these different kinds of people?
I looked to mentors. I looked to people. And in those days, I was full-time Wildlife Conservation Society. And so this is not a paid advertisement for WCS. But they have the savvy and experience at so many different geographies that I sought out advice on how best to do this. But more directly to your question, I never pretended I was a cowboy. I mean, this was out in rural Wyoming. I don't wear cowboy boots. I do know how to ride a horse, but very poorly and usually fall off. And I just felt that if you treat people with respect, you don't have to agree, but you have to be a good listener. And we would work through what the issues are, what the concerns are. But the bottom line question for me was, do you like open space? Do you like looking at animals? How do we maintain this in a way that your generational history here and that of other Americans can celebrate? And I ended up going back to Capitol Hill a couple of times, talking with folks from Wyoming there. So it was a complicated mix involving science, involving politics, involving people who see the world differently and some the same.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's wonderful that you're kind of building those bridges between science and all these different areas, because I think they are critically important today. And we talked about some of the work that you're doing in addition in your communication side through writing books. We'll definitely include your books on our website for our listeners to find there. But do you have other books that you would like to recommend for me and our listeners to read for fun?
So I mentioned Amy Vetter and I mentioned Bill Weber, Bill who had asked the question, Joel, who cares? And Amy, who I was starstruck by for what she was achieving, both in science and as a woman and as a conservationist. They wrote a book called In the Kingdom of Gorillas, which was a marvelous mix of everything that I've just talked about. And then as somebody who has ignited, I think, the public through science writing, through strong nature writing, is David Quammen. And has written a couple of more recent books, but his book Spillover predated COVID by a number of years. And it's just a phenomenal read about how scientists put together puzzles and move forward. It reads more like a mystery.
Oh, interesting. Well, we will add these recommendations to our website for our listeners to find. And I know we mentioned that you have a couple of different books that you've worked on, and your most recent book is called Extreme Conservation: Life at the Edges of the World. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this book, Joel?
Thanks for the opportunity. So extreme conservation has many different meanings. The way I was using it was to think about extreme environments. And so those pretty much where life on land stops. So the northern edges of the hemisphere, so Arctic, where Arctic hits ocean. I think about the highest of mountains, and so where the Himalayas no longer support any mammalian life at about 20,000 feet, down into Patagonia perhaps. But then I focus on the species that live in those environments. And so in the Gobi Desert, for instance, there's this elegant but highly endangered antelope, actually multiple ones. One's called the Chiru, another one is called the Saiga. As I said earlier, pretty much not many voices for these species. So that's out in the Gobi. Takin, which are Bhutan's national mammal, go up to 17,000 feet. They also are unknown to most, despite being a national mammal. Wild yaks. We have something like 14 or 15 million domestic yaks in the world. Somebody mentions yak. If you're an American, you think yakety yak, don't look back. But no, we have about 10 or 20,000 wild yaks left in the world. They're all on the Tibetan plateau. They're all high elevation. They're the totem for the Tibetan people, but they're off the radar. So the book Extreme Conservation not only profiles these species, but profiles somewhat some of my efforts, but my efforts more so through the eyes of the people who helped me. So whether it's Mongolian herders out in the Gobi, whether it's Bhutanese trailblazers, I've worked for almost 10 years with a fellow named Freddie Goodhope, and his ancestors have been in the Arctic for more than 10,000 years. He's an Inupiat, super astute. And when I met Freddie, I asked, can you keep me alive? And he said, well, I don't know, Joel. We're going to find out. So dry humor, serious conservation, but also the challenges and the politics of what it is to get to first base and hopefully get to second, third, and score some victories in conservation.
Absolutely. And you've worked on a wide variety, 30 or so species. How do you decide where you want to work next or what animals you want to focus on?
Picking a problem is really difficult, and I usually try to interface 4 approaches. I will maybe select a species that, again, seems to be in need of some help, but maybe I'm overemphasizing whatever I think I might have to offer. So I'll visit the country. I'll talk to the government officials in that country. I'll talk to a university in that country and interview local university scientists as to what they think the issues are and if there's anything we can bring to the table. I will talk to whatever local NGO, non-government organizations are, because their perspectives are often different. And then I'll go out to the rural areas where these animals are, and I'll talk to the local people and ask what they think. And then I will have 4 different intersecting avenues, and I'll look at where they overlap and ask, is this something that I can bring to the table? Is this something I can find funding for? But mostly, is this something where we might be able to enhance the conservation of those species while still helping people and certainly not being in the face of people?
Very interesting. Well, Joel, it's great to get some insight into your work and how you approach these kinds of problems. And I know we could probably talk for weeks about your travel experiences alone. You've been to so many places and worked on so many cool projects around the world. But do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
I would have to say probably the Namib Desert. And here's why. If any of the listeners have been traveling, we'll say, to deserts beyond Las Vegas, maybe Death Valley, there the average is about 8 centimeters, something in the realm of 2 to 3 inches a year. In the Namib Desert, the rainfall is less, and yet you still have not only ostriches, but you have elephants, you have rhinos, you have lions, you have zebras, 2 species of zebras. And so you have a fauna at low density, but it's the same fauna that's been there for thousands and thousands of years. So you don't find places like that anymore.
Oh, absolutely. So what was the occasion that brought you to the Namib Desert for the first time?
So that was when we were focusing on dehorning of rhinos. And to find the rhinos, which were very difficult, we had to travel very, very large areas. And in doing so, and then camping out in those areas, we would see the magic of these other species.
Definitely. And for our listeners out there who maybe are living vicariously through the field experiences of the scientists we interview, what is a day in the field like there in the desert?
For us, it was very challenging because, as I said, we had a very young daughter, less than 20 months old. So the daughter could not go in the field with us. And so we had to, one of us, either my wife at the time, Carol, or I would stay with Sonia. But we also had hired a convicted fellow named Archie Gavusev. And Archie's sentence was 3 years on a conservation project. So a very different way of viewing it than, we'll say, the American justice system. So Archie and I, or Archie and Carol, depending who was staying back at camp, we would have to go out and find rhino footprints, evaluate whether they were old or fresh. If they were fresh, we would have to follow them to the point of where we could find the rhino and then do observations and then gather some technical information using photogrammetry or remote photos so we could approximate the size and the regrowth of the horns of these animals. So it was trying. It was hot. There wasn't much water. It was sweaty. We had to be careful about snakes, and we had to hike a lot of distances. And Archie was always in marvelous shape, and Carol and I were okay.
That's a good way to get in shape quickly, right? Got your heat training.
Yeah, severe heat training is right. Yes.
Well, this sounds like an amazing experience. And I think what people picture when they think about people doing science is sort of the traditional clean white coat in a pristine laboratory. And clearly your work does not fit this mold. And I think trying to break some of the stereotypes that people have about science and scientists is really important because there are so many creative, funny, imaginative, amazing people who have these incredible experiences in science. So we like to showcase the human side of science, the unexpected moments, the fun memories, and maybe the quirky traditions even that people have in science. So Joel, do you have a story or an example from your own experiences that you could share with us today that show this human side of science that people don't often get to see?
So when I was working Wrangel Island, and so placing this again, this is island, Russian Arctic, wintertime. You mentioned white coats. Mm-hmm. So my Russian colleagues handed me a white sniper suit. They said, you will blend in white with the snow. Why don't you wear this and you'll be more effective at sneaking up on animals? So yes, I did have my white suit too, but it's different than maybe the white suit that Marie once wore.
That is amazing. So was it effective camouflage? Were you more effective at sneaking up on animals wearing this coat or this suit?
I was terrified, because my interest was understanding how polar bears would respond to a potential new predator, that being polar bears on land, because muskox are always on land, but polar bears, because of the receding ice, are on land more now. So to gather the information that I needed, I dressed as a polar bear to view the responses of muskox. But then I had other suits too that I would wear, like a caribou suit, because that's a non-dangerous predator. To answer your question, it was frightening because a couple of times I ran into real polar bears in my fake polar bear suit.
And they were not fooled, right?
Not cool.
So what do you do? I guess what is the standard advice that people give for what to do when you encounter a polar bear?
You hope, you cross your fingers, because you can't outrun a polar bear. There are no places to go hide. In the two cases where I did this in the polar bear suit, as I was trying to sneak up on muskox, I was fortunate because both times it was a polar bear mother with new cubs, and they didn't want to mess. Many times a bear will be defensive, and they just turned and went the other direction. But still, my heart was pounding. Yeah. I was weaponless. I didn't have any kind of a fallback. My Russian sponsors were about 2 kilometers or just a little over a mile away, because polar bears only hunt as singletons. And so I could not have my Russian colleagues in the field with me sneaking up, because that's not realistic.
Absolutely. Well, I've got this amazing picture in my mind of you wearing a polar bear suit and kind of scooting around on the ice. That is phenomenal. And I think showing these stories or sharing these examples of what life is actually like, kind of the everyday life of a scientist, for what people don't necessarily get to see when they're just reading those dry, boring literature papers, is really important. And you face a lot of challenges in the work that you do. We've highlighted some of them in our discussion today. But I guess if we gave you all of the funding and staff and technology you could potentially desire and removed feasibility as a barrier, what is the one question, Joel, that you would want to answer most?
The single question would be this: how do we move the needle on world markets so that we're more kind to animals, so that we do better conservation? And so let me put this in context. Cashmere is a beautiful product, lovely product, both as a garment and for the fashion industry. 90% of the world's cashmere comes out of Mongolia and China, 90%. The people who produce it are herders, usually reasonably impoverished, working over vast landscapes. So nobody can blame them. They want to make a living just as I want to make a living, just as everybody wants some comfort. But as a consequence of our Western insatiable desire to wear cashmere, we're endangering yaks, snow leopards, Przewalski horses, Bactrian camels, blue sheep, Kiang, Hulan, Saiga, Marie, all these species except for snow leopards that don't have much of a voice. So with more funding, with opportunity, I would like to move the needle on world markets by bringing in people to discuss how we better do this, both for the environment and for biological diversity and for the people who live there. And that's a magic wand.
Absolutely. Moving that needle is tough. I think the first step is just sort of getting people aware of these issues. What do you see as the biggest barriers then after that?
People can change. Around the 1900s, ostrich feathers were the plume that people wanted in Europe. And it fell out of favor within about 10 years. And so I think there are opportunities to change some components of some value systems. But as you just mentioned, education, exposure, maybe not the word education, but exposure to what the trade-offs are would be a very good beginning spot. And a second beginning spot would be involvement, obviously, of the fashion industry. Several of the different groups that do this, whether in Italy or in France, do have strong environmental programs.
Fantastic. Well, I'm so glad you brought up these issues and we were able to have this part of the conversation today. And I'd love to end our conversation by sharing some advice for our listeners, many of whom may be on their own scientific journeys. So, Joel, what is the best advice that you've ever been given in your life or your career?
It was probably be curious, read, explore, and follow your heart.
Oh, I love that. Fantastic advice. Is there any other last note of inspiration or last piece of advice you want to give our listeners today at the end of our conversation?
I'll give you a very short line on what I ask to my graduate students, because I mentor graduate students. When I'm not wearing the WCS hat, I'm a professor, of course, at Colorado State University. So I ask my students, pretend you're on a train, and the train is zooming along. Do you want to be at the front where the engineer and the driver is? Do you want to be in a mid compartment where maybe it's safer? Or do you want to be at the end at the caboose? So they think about it, maybe roll their eyes, and then they'll offer an answer. And then I say to them, get off the train, make your own path. Don't follow others.
Do you feel like this is something that you've incorporated into your own career?
People think I'm deranged. There you go.
You've gone off the tracks.
I probably have.
Well, Joel, I think that is wonderful advice, encouraging people to kind of pave their own path in their life and their career and not feel like they have to kind of follow that one path that lays before them. So if our listeners want to learn more about you and the wonderful work that you're doing, what is the best way for them to do so?
Maybe visit my website, which is an easy one. It's joelbergerconservation.com. So Joel Berger Conservation is all run together, no spaces, joelbergerconservation.com. And that will list my books. It'll show a couple of videos, and then it's got some of the dry science, but also philosophy behind that and some of the PR and the controversies that my group and I have gotten ourselves into as well.
Certainly. Well, listeners, definitely check out that website. A great resource, a lot of material on there. And Joel, we appreciate you sharing your insights and stories with us today.
Marie, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's been a pleasure to chat with you, and listeners, wonderful to have you here as well. And we hope you join us for our next episode of People Behind the Science.